When we go outside to take photographs or to paint, the most important thing is what the light is doing. And today I want to talk about light in the morning, what to look for, how to set things up so that the painting reads well when painting in the morning. Okay, today we are talking about painting morning light. And the thing about morning light, and the same kind of with evening light, the sun is very low, so we have a lot of contrast, a lot of big dark and light areas. And that does two things. One thing, it creates a lot of drama. It makes the painting more exciting to look at. There's a lot going on as far as strong contrast. The second thing is it's also easier to paint, because it does give us bigger, stronger shapes of dark and light. That's a lot easier to paint than midday or a cloudy day where everything's half-toned and it's, you get lost in the small little shapes and in detail. Here, the large masses of dark and light are set up pretty well. There's just no question where the light's coming from, the shape of the shadows. The problem lies in seeing too much too soon. We see this big shadow pattern and we know which way the light's coming from, but we tend to fixate on the small little dark and light value changes within the photograph, whether it's in this shadow area right in here where the rocks are, the stuff going on in the trees or in the creek. We get lost in that and lost in thinking about color, and we lose that big pattern, and we lose the sense of light. And I think I've finally gotten to the point after 40 years of realizing that's the most important thing. I was always told that capturing the light is the most important thing. But after messing it up so many times, I realize the more I can hold on to this big dark pattern and the big light pattern and not mess it up as I try and finish the painting, the better the painting. So we're going to think in terms of finding that big pattern and establishing it right away, which is easier said than done because, again, we get caught up in this stuff, these light rocks in the shadow. And one of the problems is as we're drawing on the canvas, we tend to draw all these rocks. We'll spend time drawing these and all these different trees in here when that really doesn't matter because we're going to mess all that up with the big dark and light pattern. It is much easier to see this big dark shadow pattern and establish that. And as long as it's dark and cool, it really doesn't matter about the color. I can pick a color, whether I'm picking the dark blue-green or I'm picking kind of a violet of the dirt. I picked the violet of the dirt. Maybe the dark blue-green would have been better of the trees. But just fill in the whole thing, the rocks, the water, the dirt, the trees, and establish that dark shadow pattern because that gives you something to paint into. So after I establish that, and maybe a couple of lines to separate this shape of these trees from the background hill from the sky, I don't have to do much drawing. All the drawing and painting goes after I get this big solid mass of dark and light in here. So that I establish the dark shadow here, maybe change the color for the dark shadow on the aspens and the trees and shrubbery, but keeping it big and simple. And the longer I can keep it big and simple without seeing the detail and get these value relationships right, the value of the shadow compared to the value of the rocks here. And what I would probably do, establishing color, maybe pick the light yellow-green of the grass here and just fill it in. Again, go for extremes. I don't want to get too light. This might be a bit too light. But even at too light, it still is showing that strong contrast. So I can come in here and establish that and establish the rocks. Now, before I start adding color, I'm probably doing a little bit of an outline of just the plains. Again, just a line to separate the sky shape from the mountain shape. A line here to separate the ground and the water from the hill where the trees are. A little line here, and then maybe a line there. And that's all of the drawing I need to do. Then I want to get to these big dark masses and light masses. And the simpler I keep it, the better. And the longer I can resist doing any detail in here, the better. Keep working with these big masses until you get the right value relationship. Same thing with the water. Pick one, whether it's blue-violet or violet with a little orange, one mass in there. So keeping it that simple for as long as possible, because this is what matters. Getting the right value of the shadow with the right value of the sunlight on the ground, dark and light on the trees, and so on. So next step here, again, just the value of the rock, value of the water. Now the rocks, I'm massing them together a bit more. The rocks are too picky, just like the shadowed hillside here. These little dark and light rocks in the shadow break it up too much. Same thing in the sunlight. All these little rocks are way too much. And not only do I not draw them in the beginning before I start adding color, I don't have anything to do with them. Again, just a simple line to separate the ground from the water. Then as I continue to paint, I'll mass those rocks together and create bigger shapes. There, they're all broken up. Here, they're pulled together a bit more. Again, the more I can simplify and work on the value relationships. Then I can gradually start breaking up this shadow after everything is filled in. Don't do that too soon. Some of these rocks here, the sunlit rocks, they're darker in shadow. But they're a lighter dark than the big shadow because they're white rocks. If they were black rocks, they would be darker, but they're white. And then I can start messing around with some values of the rocks, the dirt, trees. I didn't do too much here, but you can see you can paint into this overall shadow color. And that shadow color, again, could have been a bluish green. If I see mostly blue-green in the shadow because of the trees, or I could do the violet of the rocks, which I think I did. But it's something to paint into. It's something that, as I paint the dark blue-green into this kind of muted violet, it sinks into that muted violet and keeps it in the shadow. Same thing with the lighter rocks. It just keeps it in the shadow more. Then I can start breaking up things by adding more colors within these big masses. But I don't want to add too much value change. In fact, I wouldn't want to get many more different values than what I have right here. You can see how much simpler this is than the photograph. Now, my computerized painting here doesn't do much as far as brush work or technique. It's just talking about big values, dark and light shape, and warm and cool color to suggest the light. And the simpler I can keep this, the better. So if my painting looks like this, and I'm 3/4 of the way done, or even 7/8 of the way done, it's going to work. But it's when I get too caught up in the detail and these lights start getting lighter and I'm focusing more on the color that I'm going to lose that sense of light. So keep your painting at this stage for as long as possible. In fact, the end result should look a lot closer to this than the photograph because the camera just picks up too much detail in the trees, in the big shadow here of the rocks and the water. Remember, our goal is just to suggest the light and see how simple we can keep it. Now, in this reference, everything is either a simple dark or a simple light when I look at the reference. So I'm going to start with big areas of dark and light. There's not a lot of small little lights somewhere or small little dark somewhere that's going to mess it up. So I can go ahead and, again, just establish that big dark and light pattern. But some images are a little bit different, like this one. This is in New Mexico, and it has some real simple dark and light, like the light here and dark here, and that's real simple. I can separate that just like the last photograph, pretty easy. But when you get into things like this, where you have a lot of little darks and lights in these trees here, these trees there, also back here on these hills, where you have dark and light shapes, it's a lot smaller. What you want to do is not in your block-in stage get too much little dark and light shapes. Don't break it up. Keep it big and simple. So for these trees back here in the distance, I want to pick the one value that kind of dominates. And for these trees back in here, it's the shadow. So I would block in the shadow. I should block it in all over. I'd fill in all those trees with the shadow. And of course the shadow on the ground. And same thing back in here, I would use this blue-green right here to mass in this big shape of these background trees. Then on top, I would add the lights. So on top of this kind of muted violet, I would add the lighter orange. In other words, I would block those trees in. After I get a few lines to separate the big shapes, block that in, and then with a slightly muted kind of light orange, I would come on top and get the smaller lights. But that works a lot better, even though that doesn't look very good. Works a lot better than trying to get too many lights and darks on there, like it shows in the first. Just block that in mostly dark, or if you see it mostly light, block it in light and then add the darks, which is what I did in the background hills. I see mostly light, so I block in the overall light value, add the darks, and then a little halftone. So start when you're painting an area or big shape, start with the overall value. Here it's probably mostly dark, then add the lights. Back here in these trees, mostly dark, then add the lights on top. And then back in here, mostly light, so start with the muted orange, then add the darker blues, then a little halftone. So painting should be simpler than what it looks like. So if you're getting bored real quick because you're getting too many small picky areas, if I can simplify it, that's better. So you should have that feeling of, I can do this because I can simplify that. And that's going to make it work better. As opposed to the idea that I have to copy the photograph and start putting all these little darks and lights in there. When we move away from the big masses of dark and light, we're moving towards detail and we're going to lose the light. So the more I can keep it bigger and simpler, the better. Same thing with this foreground here. I'm going to pick one overall value. I'm going to go with the darker value in the shadow. And again, that gives me that strong contrast between the dark and the light. Then I can come back in and get the lighter. And just keep it to those two values. I might add another color within this value or another color within that value, but I'm not going to add different values. So whatever color I add in here, maybe a muted green, or blue-green, I would make it the same value as that. Same thing with the shadow. I want more color in there. Although the shadow areas are always going to be more simple than the lights. Most of my detail is going to be in the lighter areas. And I'm going to keep my shadows a lot more simple. Same thing with this one here. It's mostly shadow. And you don't want a photograph where it's half light, half dark. And there is the same amount of light space as there is dark space. And you can always change it some. If it was half and half, you could add just a bit more light or a bit more dark. So one or the other kind of dominates. And this is shadow dominates. It's pretty obvious. But there's a lot of little darks and lights in these shadows. The bigger the shadows, the more you can see into them. So I would start with one overall color for this foreground shadow and one overall dark color for the background shadow, because they're two different values. This one in front's darker, mainly because it's closer, but also because there's a slight, I'm looking at a wash, and this is a hill here, so it's a value change there. But they're both in shadow. Then I can add the lights. Keep it real simple. I see mostly shadow, so lights will go on top. Darks are going to be somewhat thinner, which means if I load up the paint on the lights, they'll go on and really jump out. Same thing in here, the lights in the foreground grasses really stand out. And again, if I get that thicker, it goes on top of the thinner darks without any problem. Then I can add darker darks in the shadow and add some other colors, same value, just kind of some other colors in the shadow. And same thing with add a little bluer on the flat plane of that wash. But again, this is the drama. I mean, it doesn't look that great on the computer, but paint-wise, the colors would blend slightly. Even though I keep the lights thicker so they stand out more, they wouldn't stand out this much. But if I follow that kind of idea of simple masses, simple dark and light, and keep them big. These trees back in here, I'd probably block them all in light. I would probably pick maybe the yellow or the yellow-orange and just fill them in. And while that's wet, I could add some of the reddish orange or lighter orange or more of a yellow green in a few areas. I can break up that color in the light area and then come back and add shadows in here. So again, the more you can find the overall value, but if it's half and half, I would go ahead and, like we did on the first image, this shadow is so strong, it's better to separate the lights and darks right away. But in this one, it's a lot better to hit the darks and then the lights on top. Trees back in here are different. There's mostly lights, so I could hit the lights, then the darks on top. The whole overall idea is fairly simple. It can get more complicated depending on the subject. And this is another complicated one. But if I can see these trees back in here, instead of trying to start by drawing all these little limbs before I start the color, much better to go ahead and mass it in dark. Block in all this background tree with a dark muted blue-green, a light, slightly muted yellow-orange, and kind of a darker red-orange on this tree here. Then I can add the lights on top, or in this case, the dark on top. I started with the light yellow and added the dark. These, I start with the dark and I add these light areas. And I'm also simplifying them quite a bit. Way too much detail in the photograph. So the overall dark shape, strategically placed sky holes to give the tree some shape and form. And then the same thing with the house. I see an overall lighter shadow on this side of the house, darker shadow on this side. This house is going, goes this way, then it changes direction and goes that way. So it really changes direction. And whenever you have direction change like that, there has to be a value change. Even though they're both in the shadow, this shadow has to be a different value from this shadow because they're changing direction. So remember that. Even though it's in the dark or in the light, there has to be a value change. Then I can add the lighter light here because, again, the light is a little bit lighter on this side and a little bit darker, more of a halftone on that side. Because again, it changes form, changes direction. So there has to be a value change. So you can see the simplicity here. And I can take it now as far as I want. I could work for months on it and put every detail I see in the reference. Wouldn't want to do that, but even if I'm going to add a lot of detail, I would still get it to this point first because this establishes the light. Not trying to follow too much detail. So if I get it to this point with just simple dark and light, then decide where I want my detail, the house, maybe a little bit more in the trees, but not much. And that just keeps the light more important. And once you establish that light, you don't want to lose it by doing too much in these shadows. That's what's going to kill our painting. The more you can simplify the block in, the better.